Hi, this is Teresa Hobson, a doctoral candidate and researcher with a particular focus on the Philippines. I will guide you through a presentation on the sources of violence and displacement in the Philippines after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship in 1986 and after 9/11. About 30 years ago now, the Philippines started its democratic transition, the first in Southeast Asia to do so, joining Japan and India in broader Asia. The bloodless people power that ended the dictatorship was celebrated as a successful nonviolent movement, yet the following transition missed opportunities for establishing human security and the deepening of democracy. In this presentation, we explore how internal security issues in the Philippines challenge or support democratic consolidation, and how the adoption of counterterrorism norms shape internal security policies in the Philippines. By democratic consolidation, we mean the way democracy stabilizes and survives, away from the danger of reverting to authoritarianism, as described by Larry Diamond and other scholars. This presentation focuses on two internal security issues persistent today: the communist and Moro insurgencies. This brief presentation consists of the following parts. First, a short excursion into the state building history of the Philippines is in order to provide a background of the present day conflicts. Persisting security issues in the Philippines are rooted in the colonial history of the country as well as the character of the authoritarian regime that preceded the democratic transition. Secondly, I will describe the insecurities and the security strategies of the regimes during the transition to democracy after 1986. And finally, I will talk about how 9/11 has impacted the Philippines, specifically how the new norms of the war on terror has been used by the Philippine state to brand insurgent groups as terrorists. So, firstly, the context of the conflicts. Present day conflicts have deep roots in the violent state formation of the Philippines. In this section, I will then talk about colonization and the mapping and the census that went into the making of colonial subjects. I will also briefly describe the governance of the colony, the resistance to colonial rule, and then fast forward to the authoritarian regime in the Philippines. The islands now called the Philippines is home to a diverse peoples speaking over 180 Austronesian languages. Some historians assert that prior to Spanish colonization in 1521, the most complex political organization was a confederation of sultanates in Mindanao, southern Philippines. The Philippines has three groups of islands: Luzon in the north, Visayas in the middle, and Mindanao, colored red on the map, in the south. That the Philippines is the only country in the world that has the dubious distinction of bearing the name of its colonial ruler, Philip II of Spain, only supports the fact that imagination of the Philippines was entirely external. The map on the left was made in 1734, commissioned by the Spanish. It is useful to compare it to the map on the right, made in 1890 by Blumentritt, which shows Territorios de los Hispánico-Filipino, or the territories of Spanish Filipinos, marked red. Distinguished from the territories of the pagans, in yellow, and the territories of the Muslims or the Moros, in green. In this sense, the census of the Filipinos or Indios were distinguished from the pagans and the Muslims. This relates to Scots' governable spaces because many of the indigenous peoples who fled to the mountain regions resisted colonization and Christianity. Where the Spanish were able to build churches through forced labor, they claimed all lands under the church bells were theirs and proceeded to convert tracts of land for cash crops for trading in the Manila-Acapulco galleon route. The Philippines has a Christian majority and exemption in Southeast Asia for centuries, until East Timor became independent in 1999. The Spanish ruled very cheaply, meaning they did not invest in their colony to improve people's lives. They also had an arterial rule, meaning They ruled thinly and concentrated efforts in the capitals. These fueled unrest among the Indios, who have, towards the end of the 19th century, mounted a sizable resistance that mobilized lowland regions in Luzon and the Visayas. Just as the Indios, or the Filipinos under Spanish rule, were winning the war against Spain, Spain sold the Philippines to the United States in 1898 for $20 million, bundled with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. There were negotiations as to which parts of the Philippines were to be sold, and the United States insisted that it would be all or nothing of the Philippine Islands. They meant that Mindanao should be included in the deal, even though the Spanish barely occupied Mindanao. Present day insurgencies may be seen as continuations of previous struggles of the people now known as the Filipinos. For instance, the Moros of Mindanao, who have largely resisted Spanish colonization, are still struggling with the succeeding regimes. Likewise, the communist insurgents sometimes allude to their struggle as a continuation of the revolutionary movement in 1896 that fought for independence from Spain. On the 34th anniversary of the 1896 Katipunan Revolt, Crisanto Evangelista announced in 1930 the birth of the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or the Communist Party of the Philippines. In 1935, the Americans conceded to grant the Philippines independence after a 10-year Commonwealth or transition period. However, they have enshrined in the 1935 Constitution the Regalian Doctrine, or the state ownership of all lands, meaning private titles must be granted from the Spanish Crown, the American colonial government, and afterwards the Philippine Republic. Another context to the present day insurgencies is the very character of the Marcos authoritarian regime from 1972 to 1986. Ferdinand Marcos was president for 2 terms, the maximum allowed in the 1935 Constitution. To stay in power, however, he declared martial rule and created the 1973 Constitution that allowed him to rule for a total of 20 years. Under his rule, he centralized authority to himself and collaborated with allies in localities, challenging traditional elites on the ground. Scholars like Abinales in 2000 insisted that the Marcoses' weakening of traditional elites made fertile ground for other challengers to the state, such as insurgent groups. It was during the Marcos regime that the Communist Party of the Philippines, or CPP, has been re-established by Jose Maria Sison, and the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF, by Nur Misuari. To secure his rule, Marcos politicized the military and enriched many of his loyalists. Marcos had a horrendous human rights violation record, which, according to McCoy in 2001, included over 3,200 extrajudicial killings, 35,000 torture victims, and 70,000 detentions. It was so bad that salvaging had a new meaning: to kill instead of save in the Philippines. Of course, this was martial law and many more cases were unrecorded. Instead of quelling resistance, Marcos was deemed as the number one recruiter for the communist-led New People's Army, or NPA, because many young people saw the armed resistance as a real counterpoint to the military rule. In fact, the International Crisis Group in 2011 notes that the NPA swelled to more than 25,000 fighters in 1986, and the CPP membership reached 30,000. At their peak, the NPA operated in 69 of 80 provinces in the Philippines. While Marcos's army focused on the MNLF, the CPP-NPA was able to gain ground. Marcos's military supported a vigilante group in Mindanao, the Ilaga, which targeted Muslim populations and were prime suspects in the Jabida and Takbil massacres, which killed 68 Muslim recruits and 1,776 Muslims praying in a mosque, respectively. These human rights violations fueled the unrest in Mindanao and resulted in the support for the MNLF. Marcos opened a peace deal with the MNLF in 1976, which resulted in the latter's acceptance of autonomy. This event prompted serious rift within MNLF and led to the breaking away of Hashim Salamat in 1977, who formally established the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, in 1984. The MILF pursued the secessionist path that MNLF abandoned. So, to summarize the first part of this presentation, I proffer that human insecurity because of land dispossession and marginalization of the majority of the Filipinos in the colonial regimes were causes for armed conflict or armed social movements in the Philippines. The human rights violations during martial law only popularized these movements.